Just one look at that turbocharger. That's all I'm asking.
Hello, I'm the Smoking Cheddar, but you probably already knew that. Welcome to my sad little corner of the internet once again. This week we're going to be looking at the latest and greatest fighter pilot available in-game, Sky Jockey Isabel Gomez, fighter plane critical strike. As usual, we will be grading the skills 1 to 5. We'll start off with the tactical skill and we'll move along until we get to the awakened skill. And at the end, we'll discuss a few ways that perhaps we can use this officer. Edge of the blade. If this officer is in a fighter plane troop, its damage is increased by up to 15% and its normal attacks have up to 40% chance of performing a critical strike dealing 150% damage. It's kind of hard to describe how good this is, because typically when we discuss the ground units, we're talking in terms of damage coefficiency. Now, with the fighter plane pilots, there is only one tactical skill from Blade Wing which gives damage coefficient, and there's now only two officers that once they're awakened, Silver Comet and also Sky Jockey, that will give damage coefficiency, but they only go up to 200. Blade Wing goes up to 1100. So it means that when it comes to fighters, you have to look for other ways to commit your fighter to deal damage. Now, critical strike is a good one. It's a very good one, obviously, especially with high firepower. You're going to have a very high rate of fire. You're going to be dealing a lot of damage. So critical strike is a good way to commit to this. I think this is a 5, and I'll explain why. It's because the other critical strike that's available to you through Brisk Eagle only goes up to 40%. This goes up to 40% and it gives you a damage buff of an additional 15%, which means that critical strike damage is going to be hitting harder because you're going to have a higher base stat to work from. So it's a 5. Moving on to adaptive weaponry. Increases the intercept of this officer's fighter plane by up to 35% and the damage buff by up to 10%. Now, this is a 4, and that's only because it depends on what fighter you're using. Now, if you're using a Vanguard fighter, that's going to have a high intercept, that's going to be very good. If you're using a Martyr fighter or perhaps a Liberty fighter, the damage buff will be more what you're looking for, and the intercept buff is not really going to be something that you're after. So, you know, it's a 4. There's room for improvement. I'd like it maybe if it was pure intercept or pure damage. It sits at a nice place in the road. It's not a rubbish skill. It's a very good skill. Could be better, but it certainly couldn't get better by much. Standardized skier, the third skill, it's a balanced skill. Increases the firepower of this officer's troop by up to 20% and the HP by up to 20%. This is a 4 all day long. Again, if you're putting this as a trained skill, particularly with someone who can provide a shield for your fighter or for your bomber even, it's a very good skill. It's good on any fighter because the firepower bonus means higher rate of fire, higher chance to hit, and all those other lovely goodnesses that mean your fighter is going to be effective in the air. So it's a 4. The only reason why I'm not going to plant it as a 5 is because it doesn't feed into the critical strike too well. While firepower does have 3 stats it affects, which is hit rate, rate of fire, and damage. I think this would be a 5 if it was a 20% damage buff, just a flat 20% damage buff with maybe a 10% HP buff. It's a personal preference at this point. It's an excellent skill, trained and usable on fighters. We're moving on to the fourth skill, tactical equipment increases the maneuverability of this officer's fighter plane troop by up to 20% and its damage resist by up to 5%. Now obviously this skill only affects fighters, so while you can train it in on a bomber just to get the 5% damage resist buff, it's a complete waste of time. Don't do that. Maneuverability of 20% is very, very nice. If you look down the advanced tech tree in particular, for fighters, they get a lot of maneuverability bonuses, and if you train this skill in with the Witcher, who has also a 20% maneuverability bonus, you can really stack that chance to dodge. So this is a 5 because the only other maneuverability skill that we have, which is extremely high at 20% as well, doesn't have the bonus damage resist. This does. So this is a 5. And rather quickly and quite neatly that brings us to the awakened skill, Blade of Annihilation. This officer's fighter plane troop will strike an enemy target after landing a critical strike with normal attacks, dealing skill damage of 200 coefficient and can trigger once every 2 seconds. It's hard to say that this is a bad skill. We love our damage coefficiency. It's going to be a 5. This skill, over the course of an 8-second charge time for a standard ground equivalency, we should say, this deals 800 coefficient damage, providing you're popping off the critical strikes. So this is a pretty good skill. If you're pairing this with another critical strike officer, you are going to be getting a lot of coefficient damage off at regular intervals. It's going to eliminate the charge time, and of course skill damage in the air cannot be avoided, so it's just going to deal that flat 800 over 8 seconds, once every 2 seconds, 200. It's going to deal that coefficient damage to a plane. It's going to knock a plane out of the sky. It's going to make the enemy squadron weaker. This is a 5. So this brings us neatly into the scoring. She scores a 4.6. Now, I've rushed through this a little bit because I haven't had too much time to play with this officer. I don't really know a great deal about it because I don't have her awakened on any of my accounts. What I can tell you is that if you are building an interceptor and then you're stacking that interceptor with critical strike damage, this is a must, because every 2 seconds you're going to be popping off 200 damage coefficiency. If you have a high enough critical strike rating, you're going to be dealing at least one attack with a high firepower and a high critical strike rating. You'll be dealing one attack every couple of seconds, and you've got a high chance of that being a damage coefficiency skill or skill damage skill, which is, like I said earlier, it's going to knock a plane out of the sky. It's going to make the enemy fighter troop weaker and give you a greater advantage in a dogfight. In terms of knocking bombers out of the sky, you stick her on an interceptor alongside Blade Wing. You put Blade in the captain and her in the aid slot. You're going to absolutely decimate other aircraft. They are not going to stand a chance. They just won't. If they're both awakened and you've got good parts on your fighter and you've got it up to the level cap that you're looking for the L4 that you're running, this is going to be a deadly officer. There is no two ways about it. You stick her on a Vanguard interceptor, she is going to deal a lot of damage. I mean, we've got an intercept buff of 35%. I mean, Blade Wing is a lounge officer and he only gives you an intercept of 50%. So that should give you some sort of indication as to how dangerous this officer is. I mean, this is a premium officer which could take up to 2 years to unlock for free unless you're prepared to sink money into the game, versus an officer you could unlock for free in 2 months. You're going to have a massive edge on your opponents. If I was going to put her in with a Martyr fighter. Again, she would be aide, and I'd be placing the Witcher in as captain for the shield and maneuverability bonuses. This would give you a healthy balance between damage coefficiency and a shield, which will help reduce incoming damage. So with the combined maneuverability bonuses that you get from both officers and from the advanced tree, that fighter would be very hard to hit, very hard to kill, and every time it landed a critical strike, it would be knocking out a plane. So that's another way you could use her. For a Liberty fighter, probably pair her with Brisk Eagle, and I'd probably put her in the captain slot for this. I mean, it doesn't really make a difference in that instance because neither of them have a tactical skill, so there's no countdown timer, and even if you put her in as captain with the other two officers, again, it doesn't really make a difference because they don't have an active tactical skill. And they do have an active tactical skill, and hers is a passive tactical skill, so hers just immediately passes over. The only reason I would ensure that she was an aide in any of these circumstances is because you're trying to save the EXP books. Once you've got her to level 30, you don't actually need to put any more EXP books in her because you've got 3 other officers that are probably already level 60, and the bonuses only ever derive from the captain of the troop. So, I mean, it doesn't really make a difference if you put her in as captain or not, but for sake of argument, if you're trying to save yourself some EXP books, you boost her up to 30 and then just stick her in the aide slot. Brisk Eagle is a wonderful officer to pair her with if you're using a Liberty fighter. The Liberty fighter is going to have quite high firepower, so it's going to have a high rate of fire, which means more chances to land critical strikes, and you're just basically using 2 critical strike officers to stack critical strike rating. So those are some situations that I would potentially use this officer in. I myself do roll a Vanguard fighter. At the moment, I am using Brisk Eagle, and that was before I knew this officer was even coming. I only found out on the day when she was released, because I don't read any of the updates, patch notes, or any of the social media from Lilith at all. And I was already using an intercept officer with a critical strike, and this fighter officer will now give me intercept and critical strike, and as I have already had a number of tests conducted in the L4 I'm currently in, both fair and out in the field, I can tell you an interceptor with a critical strike rating is exceptionally deadly, which is why I can't stress enough why you would want to put her on the Vanguard fighter. It has a high intercept rating, which means your initial strike is going to deal a lot of damage, and if you have a lot of critical strike rating on that fighter, when you hit, if it does come off as a crit, not only are you going to immediately pop off a damage coefficiency, you're going to absolutely decimate the enemy fighter squadron. And the greatest thing is, if they try and get away from you, Blade Wing won't let them. You can just keep chasing them. Just let them fall out of range, just pound after them, and then bang, hit them again with another critical strike, and just keep doing it over and over and over and over again. This is a very good officer. If you are into air power, you need to consider this officer. She is easily one of the best officers for the Sky in a fighter plane. I mean, I would struggle to argue not to use her, regardless of the fighter type you are using. Each to their own, obviously. You might have a different setup. You might already have some other officers that you'd rather use. That's fine. To be perfectly honest, I'm gobsmacked they released this officer and she's not in the lounge. I'm pretty sure that, you know, she probably should have gone into the into the officers' lounge. This is a crazy officer.